next speaker is Alfred Vick, who is assistant professor at the School of Environmental Design at the University of Georgia. And his talk is going to be about reimagining the Chattahoochee River with geodesign. And I need to find it here. Not there. There it is. Good.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, this has been great. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first Geodesign conference, and it really has been inspirational to me to see how these tools are being made more accessible. And that's relevant to my talk because I'm going to be sharing our experience integrating geodesign processes into a graduate landscape architecture course studio course at the University of Georgia College of Environment and Design. I co-teach this class with Alison Bramlet, who's my co-author on this presentation, and you heard from her yesterday. The description of this, the published course description for this class, which I want to read a part of it, is this course presents concepts of sustainable site design and their implications for landscape architecture with particular emphasis on the issues of environmental suitability, provision of ecosystem services, and geodesign. So this is built into this class. Each year we select projects for the studio that allow the students to investigate alternative design scenarios in a variety of different environmental contexts and geographic scales. Last fall, in fall of 2013, one of our projects focused on a 53-mile segment or stretch of the Chattahoochee River. The Chattahoochee, as some of you might know, begins in North Georgia, flows just north around the edge of the Atlanta metro area, and then if you're looking at the big map here, flows down along the Georgia-Alabama border, through the panhandle of Florida, and down into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the Chattahoochee has been the subject of intense political and environmental scrutiny over the past several decades. Some of you may be familiar with the tri-state water wars and other political disputes that go on about the Chattahoochee. However, it remains largely unseen and inaccessible to the residents of the Atlanta metro area, the Atlanta region. So recently, an organization, Chattahoochee Now, has formed as an NGO, and they've been established to help coordinate efforts to realize the ecological, social, and economic potential of the river to generate quality of life and economic benefits for the Atlanta area. So our studio came on board to be engaged with this group and bring the geodesign process to the planning that's going on now. Our group included 36 Masters of Landscape Architecture graduate students in this studio. They came with a range of different backgrounds. Some had undergrad degrees in architecture, landscape architecture, other design programs. We had engineering backgrounds, several different ologies, and a few that had GIS backgrounds. And I did want to also mention that 50% of our students in this studio were international, primarily from China. And the stakeholders involved in this project were dozens of different agencies, jurisdictions, and organizations that represented a broad cross-section of stakeholders with interests in the future of the Chattahoochee River. Those included EPA, National Park Service, Corps of Engineers, TPL, river keepers, 5 different counties, 4 different city governments, and many, many more. And so the purpose of our project, as we described it to the students, was to generate a land use plan for this Chattahoochee River corridor. And that plan had to seek to create a balance, and this is coming directly from the mission of Chattahoochee Now, that balances conservation, recreation, and development. So they had to meet that vision. They also had to research and understand all the context, all the work that had been done related to this corridor. Had to engage stakeholders and meet the learning objective of our course, which includes doing this within the framework of a geodesign process. So here's our process. Here's it diagrammed by me on our studio whiteboard and then more artistically rendered by one of the students at the end of the project. But what you can see here is this, hopefully, the geodesign framework, integrating and iterating throughout this process. And we did break it down into 3 kind of broad categories of inventory, analysis, and design, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about each of these. You can see the structure included teamwork and individual work, and throughout this process we were emphasizing the collaboration, but we also had to keep in mind our instructional goals of wanting each student to be able to experience every aspect of this, and so we were trying to balance the individual work with the teamwork throughout this process. So first, inventory. This phase was describing the project. We had the students, and they were seeking to assimilate existing data, generate research about the site, and establish the ecological, cultural, and economic context of the study area, and culminating in a definition of that project area. Second, in the analysis phase, in this phase, we identified, had the students identify proposed program elements and suitable locations for those to occur. I'll go into more detail on that. And then the third phase was the design phase, at which point we had the students generate alternative scenarios for this, and feedback was incorporated throughout this process. So first, the research phase, this inventory phase. So we had the students start out by researching metropolitan river case studies around the world. Each student took on one particular project which they identified themselves, and we modeled these after the Landscape Architecture Foundation case studies. So we asked the students to research these projects and to the extent that they could, document performance metrics for these projects, published by other people, and present this to the class. The whole purpose of this was to establish just the ideas, establish some possible scope, some range of possibilities that they could consider in thinking about their own designs. And then we went into truly the data collection about the site. So we broke into inventory groups. We had 6 different groups: hydrology, physiography, vegetation and biology, green space and park space, historic and cultural resources, infrastructure and transportation, and demographics. And in the studio, we brainstormed under each of these categories. What are the bits of data? What are the layers or the themes that have to be acquired to fill out and round out our understanding of these different things? And so here's the list that we generated here. And of course, you can start to imagine that each of these is associated with a different GIS layer. So we determined all these research and data needs, and then each group was tasked with going out, identifying and pulling together and presenting this data to the class. So here we're broken into 6 groups of 6 students each. I do want to point out that a lot of these students were coming in with absolutely no GIS background. They were using this for the first time. So much of the data did have to be prepared for the students, and I want to thank Jacobs Engineering for providing a lot of that data for us for use in the class. And so at the end of this inventory process, each of the groups generated a particular inventory map associated with their information, and they presented this to the rest of the studio for everyone's use. So we're kind of working in these 6 groups, working towards this inventory goal. Each student did have to then take all of this data and produce their own individual composite inventory as a way of rounding out their understanding of the entire site. Now you'll notice at this stage, here's our 53 miles running through or north of the Atlanta area. At this stage, our boundary is 5 counties, 5-county area. And we did that intentionally because we didn't know what we wanted our boundary to be. And so we began at this point, now that we knew the data and had the data, what should we set as the limits of our corridor? And we considered a number of different options. Should it be the 5-county boundaries? Should it be the Huck 12 watersheds that are adjacent to that touch the river? Should it be the kind of arbitrary jurisdictional boundary, which is a 1,000-foot Metropolitan River Protection Act boundary? And all these things didn't seem to be adequate. They didn't quite work. So through some exploration and discussion, we ended up on a 3-mile buffer on either side of the river along these 53 miles with a few little modifications to include some important resources. And this ended up being kind of the sweet spot of including most of the resources we were interested in, but not overreaching and going too far beyond. So it ended up being a 318 square mile area that we were looking at. We moved into analysis and worked with our stakeholders at this point to identify what are some of the program elements that might be included. And you can see the 12 that we listed here: active rec, agriculture, commercial development, conservation, cultural resource interpretation or education, ecological restoration, industrial development, multi-use trails, passive rec, residential development, riverfront development, and transportation enhancements. So these are our program elements. We broke into 12 groups, 3 people each, and each of these groups had to then identify what are the suitability criteria that will affect the selection of locations to think about locating these things. So each group did a bunch of research and brainstorming about what those suitability criteria would be. And again, this was a very collaborative process. We had all of this information and all the suitability criteria compiled on a big Google Docs spreadsheet that everyone in the class had access to, and of course we as faculty were monitoring and adding our own comments into it as they were working through this process. At the end of this stage, we had 12 different suitability maps, each identifying the areas that are highly or moderately or less suitable for particular land use or program element. And from there, presented this at this stage to the stakeholders and got feedback on a variety of things. Recognizing this as an iterative process, we asked questions like, what did we miss? Was our suitability criteria on target or not? How can we revise this? How can we make it more, more effective? And so the groups took that feedback and revised their suitabilities. Now, moving into the design phase, we kind of shifted everyone into individual work at this point. And one of the first things we did before letting them start design is have them take a step back, think about the inventory, the case studies, our client, the stakeholders, and establish a set of guiding principles that's going to guide them through this design process. They had to incorporate the mission of the Chattahoochee Now and stakeholder input, but each student had a slightly different priority for their guiding principles. From there, had them generate their own individual composite suitability analysis. We gave them the freedom to take different approaches to generating the composite suitability. A lot of them ended up compiling the program elements into different kind of broader themes. You can see this student thought about preservation, development, and recreation as kind of a mashup of some of those elements, and then brought those together by selecting out the most suitable areas for each of those 3 things. Other students use different methods. This is one student, just the southern portion of the corridor, and you can see the suitability analysis and then moving into the land use plan here. And so this was, he took kind of a constraining method where he identified, the most suitable areas, prioritized those, and then started kind of looking at secondary priorities after that. And a number of different strategies. I did want to point out that we had a few students that were well-versed in GIS, and so one student used the LUCIS model and actually went through a very comprehensive analysis of the land use conflicts and generating a great composite map there, and that influenced her master plan or land use plan. And so, again, a number of different things. At the end, we ended up with 36 different land use plans that we pinned up along the wall here, took up the entire studio, and again, at that point, had stakeholder feedback where we presented this to stakeholders and got their feedback. Some of the students had a more conservation-oriented approach, some a more development-oriented approach, some emphasized recreation. Most students had a pretty balanced approach to this in terms of their guiding principles. The other thing that we had them do, every student had to document their process, the process that we used. And this was probably perhaps the most valuable part of this because it really is all about the process, and this is something that we emphasized throughout the project. This was our highest priority learning objective, is that they understood the value of this process altogether. And so everyone did a diagram here. So discussion, lessons learned. First, I want to say the cyclical nature of geodesign certainly builds confidence in the students and help them refine these different scenarios. Providing that timely feedback by faculty and the stakeholders is critical. It was sometimes difficult with a group of 36 students. And so that's, we recognize that. The engaged stakeholders are priceless. The value of this geodesign process, I think, for many of the students, this was too big of an area for us to go and conduct an on-site investigation. So we got some very reliable, I think, work done without the ability to visit the site. There were some new things revealed, I think, that were valuable. The balance of individual and group work was good. It helped us avoid some of the unnecessary duplication of effort, but still allowed every student to have the complete experience. One of the things we reiterated over and over again is that this whole process is giving them the credibility and defensibility of their design when talking to their clients or our stakeholders. We had a huge range of experience with GIS. We had 2 graduate assistants to help us, and that was helpful. But it was difficult to manage the technical support needed to run a studio like this with this range of different experiences. And some students, I say here, some had difficulty with the geo in geodesign, and some had difficulty with the design in geodesign. And what I mean by that is some had difficulty with the software, with the technical aspects, and had trouble overcoming that. Some had difficulty transitioning into the more creative design part because they'd been using the GIS, and they wanted GIS to generate the master plan for them. And so that's something we as faculty really have to continue to encourage and manage that back and forth. So process is key. I think it was a very successful project, and we can fully expect to continue refining this. So, thank you.